A little more than 40 years ago, in 1982, U.S. Marines began a peacekeeping mission as part of a multinational force in war-torn Lebanon. The Marines were to maintain a visible presence in the capital of Beirut, in hopes that it would deter further bloodshed amongst the various warring factions and militias fighting for control of the country. So how did violence in the area of operation escalate? What was the result of the bloodshed? And what happened to the Marines in Beirut? Let's try and find out.
Hello, I'm Mike Droberg, a Marine Corps veteran and filmmaker, and we will try to answer these questions on today's episode of Forgotten History.
The conflicts in Lebanon that preceded Marine involvement in 1982 were complex, with the roots of violence tracing back centuries. The immediate cause of the fighting in the 1980s that precipitated Marine involvement directly stemmed from the Arab-Israeli conflicts of 1948 and 1967. Palestinian refugees fleeing the conflicts and members of the Palestinian Liberation Organization exiled from Jordan in 1970 and 71 sought safe haven in Lebanon. The presence of these immigrants exacerbated age-old ethnic and religious differences. The increasing friction between the factions ignited a civil war in 1975 between PLO, Christian, and Muslim forces. While these were the major combatants, three major religious groups and 45 different sects and political factions all vied for power during this time. At the request of the Lebanese government, Syrian troops restored order to the region and remained in the country under the Arab League mandate. However, PLO forces remained and used Lebanon as a base of operations for harassing attacks into Israel. The United States and international community unsuccessfully sought a resolution to the fighting, and Israel invaded southern Lebanon in June of 1982 in order to defeat the PLO. The superior Israeli forces quickly reached the outskirts of Beirut, the capital of Lebanon located on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. The U.S. spearheaded the resolution to the conflict by proposing the evacuation of PLO fighters from Beirut. Though the evacuation briefly ended the fighting, the assassination of the newly elected Lebanese president Bakir Gemayel, followed by the massacre of Palestinian refugees in Beirut camps, shattered any hopes of lasting peace. With Lebanon descending back into instability and chaos, President Ronald Reagan ordered the 32nd Marine Amphibious Unit to Beirut as part of the multinational force. On 29 September, the 32nd Marine Amphibious Unit landed on the coast of Lebanon and occupied positions around the Beirut International Airport. The Marines' mission revolved around the concept of providing presence. American political leaders thought that the presence of armed Marines would deter the warring factions from fighting and provide time for the Lebanese government to retain control of the situation. The Marines' time in Beirut was relatively peaceful, with the exception of a Marine killed during mine-sweeping operations and the occasional stray bullet of small arms fire from the Lebanese armed forces. The Marines spent the majority of their time constructing defenses and building bonds with the local population and other multinational force troops. Throughout their deployment, the Marines did not engage in any combat, and on 30 October 1982, the 24th Marine Amphibious Unit relieved them. The 24th Marine Amphibious Unit expanded the missions of presence during their deployment to Beirut. To increase visibility, the Marines conducted motorized and foot patrols throughout parts of the city. During this period, the Marines also began specialized training for members of the Lebanese armed forces. Surprisingly, the biggest threat to the Marines during this deployment actually came from the Israeli Defense Forces. Israeli troops were occasionally ambushed by PLO forces, which the Israelis suspect of hiding within the Marines' area of operation. In response, the Israelis probed Marine positions, often fired into Marine area of operations when engaging PLO fighters. Confrontations between the Marines and the IDF became increasingly common during this deployment and nearly resulted in the exchange of fire. To avoid further misunderstandings, diplomatic negotiations between the Israelis and Americans resulted in better communications and the hard definition of respective military lines. On February 15, 1983, the 22nd Marine Amphibious Unit relieved the 24th. The Marines of the 22nd Marine Amphibious Unit were already familiar with the mission and were moved into their old positions. On 17 April, an unknown enemy shot and nearly wounded a Marine sentry, who then returned fire with results unknown. This marked the first time the Marines returned fire in Beirut. But this event was overshadowed the next day, on 18 April, when a terrorist detonated a truck bomb at the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, killing 63 people, 17 of whom were Americans. The embassy bombing effectively changed the mission and rules of engagement for the Marines. The Marines could now return fire if they perceived a threat. On 29 May, the 24th Marine Amphibious Unit landed in Beirut to relieve the 22nd. The first week of the 24th Marine Amphibious Unit's deployment were relatively quiet. The Marines would continue to patrol and train LAF troops, the latter creating animosity from various anti-LAF factions and militias. Any doubt that the Marines were targets of these militias ended on 22nd July when the Marine positions at the Air Force received small arm, rocket, and mortar fire. The situation in Beirut further deteriorated in August as the IDF prepared to leave their positions around the capital as part of a May agreement signed by Israel and Lebanon. The presence of well-equipped Israeli forces had deterred much of the violence in Beirut, but as they began to withdraw, the fighting between various factions flared up, leaving the multinational force stuck in the middle. The LAF attempted to fill the role of the IDF, but was less well trained and equipped. As the fighting escalated, Marines found themselves on the receiving end of both stray and targeted rounds. On August 28th, the fighting around the airport reached a crescendo as the LAF engaged militia groups in the nearby neighborhoods. During this time, more than 100 rounds of mortar and rocket rounds landed within the Marine positions at the airport. The fighting continued to increase throughout September, following the complete withdrawal of the IDF on September 4th. In addition to these intense combat engagements during this period, other developments signaled a shift in American policy towards the Lebanon crisis. Though the multinational force was supposed to be a neutral peacekeeping force, its actions signaled otherwise. Lebanese militias clearly resented the Marines' effort to train LAF forces and prompted them to attack Marine positions. Any claims for American neutrality was further negated when U.S. Navy ships fired their guns in support of LAF units that reported being in danger of being overrun by militia groups on 19 September. Despite a ceasefire at the end of September, sporadic heavy fighting continued in October, and the Marines continued to take casualties. Then, on the morning of 23 October, disaster struck for the 24th Marine Amphibious Unit. At 6:22 a.m., a Mercedes-Benz stake-bed truck laden with 2,000 pounds of explosives sped past the Marine post, through a fence, and crashed into the lobby of Battalion Landing Team 1-8 headquarters building and detonated. The BLT building, housing more than 300 men, completely collapsed into a pile of rubble almost instantaneously. The compressed gas-enhanced bomb detonated by the suicide truck bomber was the largest non-nuclear explosion ever recorded. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, the Marines scrambled to ascertain the situation and take preventative measures against further attacks. Working parties and medical teams dispatched from naval ships offshore accelerated rescue operations and saved countless Marines. Unfortunately, the devastating attack left many more dead than wounded. The blast had killed 3 soldiers, 18 sailors, and 220 Marines. The Marines had to handle not only recovering the survivors, but also identifying the dead. The complete destruction of the BLT and the fact that many of the Marines were sleeping in PT gear without dog tags made the task difficult. Further compounding the problem, the BLT kept its medical records in the basement of the building, and they could not be recovered until a few days after the attack. Anyone who could positively identify the men in the BLT on the morning of 23 October was either dead or wounded. Identifying the dead required making rosters of the living and tracking down the wounded. The process was slow and painful for families back in the U.S., but it was necessary to ensure that the information was accurate. Despite the heroic efforts of all rescue workers, no survivors were located after 23 October. The searchers still worked tirelessly, and by 30 October, all Marine remains were located and transferred to planes for their final flight home to the U.S. As the deployment continued into 1984, the 22nd Marine Amphibious Unit continued to reinforce their positions and build better fortifications. In the end, the Marine and multinational force presence was contingent on the success of the Lebanese government and LAF. The fighting between the LAF and militias, particularly the Amal, intensified rapidly in February. During this time, Muslim troops of the LAF began deserting, damaging the LAF's fighting capability. As the situation became critical, Marines began evacuating American civilians from Beirut on the 7th of February. On the 18th of February, the 22nd Marine Amphibious Unit received orders for redeployment at the end of February, and they handed over control of the airport to the LAF and ended major Marine operations in Beirut. During the 18th month-long operation in Beirut, Marines suffered 238 killed and 151 wounded. In 1986, a memorial to the Beirut Marines was constructed outside the entrance of Camp Johnson in Jacksonville, North Carolina. 2 broken granite walls, representative of the crumbled BLT building, composed the memorial. The first is inscribed with the names of all American servicemen killed during operations in Beirut, while the second carries the simple inscription, "They came in peace."
Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any comments or show ideas, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks again.